It begins with silence, a silence so heavy that even the air seems unwilling to move, as though Pennsylvania itself had paused to take note of what was about to happen. In the spring of 1745, when the land was still raw with frontier tension, and every creek ran dark with the weight of unsettled history, an asylum, known to officials as the House of Correction and Care, burned to the ground in less than a single hour. Every patient inside perished, but no one was buried. There are no graves, no stones, no official list of names. The only trace that remains comes from a torn ledger found in a county archive nearly a century later. In its margins, in ink blurred by smoke and time, a single note survives. The patients sang as they burned. That is all. No dates, no numbers, no accounting of lives, just that phrase. And yet, despite the silence of official records, local oral tradition remembers more. Villagers spoke of watching from the tree line as flames climbed unnaturally fast against the evening wind. They said the fire spread not outward but inward, collapsing the roof into the wards before the walls even caught. They whispered of voices rising, not shrieks, not cries, but a terrible harmony, as though the doomed souls had been waiting for this very moment to join in one final chorus. But why? Why was this place erased from history so quickly, within a year of its destruction? Why were there no burials, no memorial stones, no archives? Why was the asylum's very existence scrubbed from maps, journals, and official reports? And most chilling of all, why do travelers today still claim that if you walk through the woods near the old river crossing in Lancaster County, you can hear voices in the night air, low, mournful, though the fire is still burning centuries later? Stay with me. Subscribe if you dare, because what we're about to uncover is not just another forgotten fire. This was an erasure, a cleansing, and the further we dig, the more we'll find that Pennsylvania's soil remembers what its officials tried to bury. The first official mention of the asylum's destruction does not come from Pennsylvania at all, but from a small news sheet printed in Maryland later that year. It was a single line, buried beneath notes on colonial trade and military movements. Fire consumes a house of correction to the north. All wards lost. No further detail. No explanation. Just that clinical dismissal, as if the destruction of an entire institution were an afterthought. But among the Pennsylvania settlers who lived nearby, the story was never so brief. In their diaries, in their whispered recollections passed down through families, the details are darker, stranger, heavier. One account describes a preacher who claimed he saw the flames before they began. 3 days prior to the fire, he dreamt of a building alight, its windows glowing like eyes in the forest. He warned his congregation not to go near the asylum, calling it a house the Lord himself will scourge. When the fire came, he told his flock it was prophecy fulfilled. Others insisted the fire was no accident. They claimed the patients had been chanting for days beforehand, their voices low, rhythmic, echoing through the trees at night. Farmers said their livestock grew restless, refusing to graze near the asylum grounds. Mothers kept their children close, afraid of what they called the wind songs. And then, on a night when no lightning split the sky and no hearth sparked stray embers, the asylum erupted in flame. Witnesses from as far as 5 miles away swore they saw the blaze leap into the heavens, yet no smoke lingered come dawn, as though the fire had devoured not just wood and stone, but memory itself. The question has always remained who lit the fire. Was it a revolt from within, desperate souls seeking escape? Was it an act of cleansing by those who feared what the asylum contained? Or was it something else, something older, something waiting in the soil long before stone walls were raised? And why, if this was a tragedy of such scale, did the colony move so quickly to bury it in silence? Stay with me, because what they did not want you to know is far more terrifying than the flames themselves. The most disturbing element of the fire was not its suddenness, nor even the silence of the officials afterward. It was what witnesses claimed they heard while it burned. The men who gathered at the tree line, too fearful to go closer, said they expected to hear screams. Dozens of patients locked inside, men and women deemed unfit for society. Surely they would have cried out as the flames took them. But they did not. Instead, what came was a song, low at first, like a hum rising through the earth itself. Then stronger, layered, impossibly unified. Witnesses spoke of harmony where there could have been only chaos. Voices, dozens of them, swelling into something that made the onlookers clutch their chests and weep without knowing why. One farmer swore the words were not in English, nor in any tongue he knew, but older, deeper, as if the forest itself was speaking. Another insisted he heard familiar hymns, twisted into shapes that were wrong, inverted, unsettling. And then, just as the roof fell inward, the singing stopped. All at once. Cut short as if commanded. When dawn came, the asylum was gone. Only smoldering timbers remained, yet no bodies were ever pulled from the ruins. None. The ash was sifted, searched, scattered, but no human remains were recorded. Officials claimed the fire was too hot. Bones could not withstand such heat. But those who had seen fire before knew better. They had watched barns burn, houses crumble, and still the dead left their traces. So what happened to the patients of the 1745 asylum? Did they perish in flames? Did someone carry them away? Or did they walk willingly into the fire, singing their way into whatever waited beyond? This is where the story begins. Not with the construction of the asylum, not with the names of its keepers, but with a question that gnaws at the very core of history. How do dozens of human beings vanish from the record of the living, leaving nothing but a whisper of song in the fire? Stay close, because in the next part, we will peel back the respectable surface of colonial Pennsylvania, the churches, the farms, the order of law, and reveal the shadows beneath, where this asylum first took root. There is one final detail from that night that makes the silence around the asylum even more disturbing. A militia captain, whose journal was discovered in a Philadelphia collection, nearly 2 centuries later, recorded that he and his men arrived at the site while the last embers still glowed. The building was reduced to ash, but the ground was curiously unburned. Grass, leaves, even fallen branches remained untouched around the ruin. It was as though the fire had been called, directed. He described the heat as unbearable, though no flame remained. His men refused to approach the center of the wreckage, claiming that the soil itself trembled beneath their boots. And then, most chillingly, he wrote of finding a circle drawn into the dirt behind the asylum. Perfect wide, etched with care. Within it were symbols he did not recognize. His journal ends abruptly there. The next entry skips 2 weeks ahead, with no mention of the asylum again. That fragment has puzzled historians and folklorists alike. Was it the captain himself who suppressed the account, pressured by colonial leaders eager to bury scandal? Or did he see something he could not describe, something that made silence safer than truth? And yet, the circle appears again in oral tradition. Families who lived in Lancaster County passed down warnings about the place, long after the asylum itself had been forgotten. Do not walk the circle, they said. It remembers what was sung. If the stories are true, then the fire was not simply a disaster, it was a ritual. One that consumed the walls, the records, and the bodies, but left behind something stronger, a memory etched into the land itself. This is why the tale refuses to vanish. This is why the past insists on being told, even when the official record is silent. Because what burned in 1745 was more than a building. It was a threshold. And the question we must now ask is simple but chilling. Who built that threshold? And what did they intend to invite through it? Stay with me, because to answer that, we must step back into the world of colonial Pennsylvania, where faith and superstition lived side by side, and where institutions like this asylum were built not only to contain the mad, but to bury truths too dangerous for daylight. They say that memory clings to places. And if that is true, then the soil of Pennsylvania remembers far more than it is willing to tell. For nearly 300 years, the site of the asylum has been avoided. Hunters do not camp there. Children dare one another to wander close, but they never linger. The air feels wrong, heavy, even in daylight. Local guides insist that the ground where the asylum once stood yields no crops. Planting fails, roots rot, cattle refuse to graze, as if the earth itself has not forgotten the screams, or the song, that once soaked into it. Travelers tell of strange sensations as they cross the area. The sudden hush of insects. The way sound seems swallowed, as though muffled by invisible walls. Some report feeling a vibration underfoot, like distant drums beating beneath the soil. A few even swear they have seen the glow of embers at night, flickering among the trees where no fire should be. And then there are the voices. Always the voices. Every account differs in detail. Some hear a low chant, others a fractured hymn, but all describe the same terrifying impression. But it is not a single voice, but many rising together. Some laugh, some cry, some hum in endless repetition, and always the sound grows stronger the longer one listens. Most flee before it overtakes them, but a handful never return. Hunters vanish, drifters disappear. Each time, the locals whisper the same phrase. The asylum took them back. This is the legend that survives in Lancaster County. Not a neat tragedy of fire and forgotten names, but a wound that never heals, a place that still feeds. As we step deeper into the story, into the colonial roots of the asylum itself, one question will haunt every page. Was this asylum built merely to confine the desperate and the broken, or was it built atop something far older, far darker, something waiting to be fed? Stay with me. Subscribe if you dare. What comes next is not simply history. It is the unraveling of the line between order and chaos, faith and blasphemy, life and death. Centuries later, scholars still puzzle over the silence surrounding the asylum. In a colony where records were kept with obsessive detail, church baptisms, land deeds, even disputes over broken fences, there is almost nothing about the institution. It is as if it was deliberately erased. One historian noted that, in the county clerk's archive, a single ledger had been cut apart, its pages missing where the asylum's expenditures should have been. The book was intact for 1743 and 1744, detailed down to the price of nails and candles. But then, as 1745 began, the record ends in torn scraps. Why would someone carve history out of existence? Theories abound. Some argue it was shame, that the asylum had been poorly run, perhaps corrupt, and that the colony's leaders preferred to forget it ever stood. Others suggest more sinister motives. The asylum's keepers had been dabbling in forbidden practices, cloaking ritual under the guise of care. Whatever the truth, the silence is louder than any record. Because silence speaks of fear. Even today, the absence feels deliberate. In museums, in libraries, in archives, one can trace nearly every tavern and mill that dotted colonial Pennsylvania. But the asylum, it is a void, and it is in that void, this gap in memory, that legend thrives. The silence left behind has become fertile soil for horror, feeding tales that persist like weeds no one dares to pull. But here is the most chilling part in the silence, in the erasure. There is one voice that managed to slip through. One that refuses to be forgotten. The ledger fragment. 7 words scrawled in smoke-stained ink. The patients sang as they burned. That is all we have. And yet it is enough to reopen the wound. Enough to remind us that what happened in 1745 was not accident, nor tragedy alone, but something far more deliberate. And in the next part, as we step into the historical context of Pennsylvania in the mid-18th century, we may begin to understand why such a place was built, and why it was destined to burn. And so we begin with absence. No bones, no names, no graves. Only ash that refused to cool, a circle carved into the soil, and a phrase half warning, half lament, written by a trembling hand. The patients sang as they burned. That is all history allows us. But oral tradition, superstition, and the weight of silence demand we look closer, because the asylum story is not merely about a building lost to fire. It is about erasure, about what happens when an entire community agrees, without speaking, to bury something too dangerous to remember. And yet memory is stubborn. It survives in whispers, in missing pages, in dreams passed from parent to child. Memory clings to places, and the soil of Lancaster County has never released this one, which is why, even now, nearly 3 centuries later, people still claim to hear the echo of voices on the night wind. A hum, a hymn, a harmony of the forgotten. But who were they? Why were they gathered? And what did they sing for? These are the questions that will guide us forward. And as we turn to the deeper history of colonial Pennsylvania, the faith, the fear, the fragile balance of order and chaos, we may begin to see the outlines of the truth. Stay with me. Subscribe if you dare, because in the next part, we will pull back the veil of respectability and step into the soil where the asylum's foundations were laid, and where its doom was written long before the fire began. To understand the fire of 1745, we must first understand the soil in which it was planted. Pennsylvania in the mid-18th century was a colony shaped by contradictions. Officially, it was the holy experiment of William Penn, a land of tolerance where faiths could coexist. But beneath that veneer lay suspicion, rivalry, and fear. Quakers, German Pietists, Scots, Irish Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Catholics lived side by side, each community wary of its neighbors. Each held its own rituals, its own traditions, and often accused the others of harboring superstition or heresy. Into this uneasy mix came the asylum. At first, it was presented as an act of benevolence, a place to house the afflicted, the disturbed, and the unwanted. In colonial records it was described as a house of correction and care, but its walls spoke a harsher truth. This was not a sanctuary, it was a vault, a means of sweeping away those who did not fit the careful image of order the colony wanted to project. The asylum's residents were not only the violently ill or criminally dangerous, they were the inconvenient. A widow whose grief made her speak aloud to shadows. A soldier who returned from frontier battles with tremors he could not control. A girl who claimed to hear voices in the trees. A boy who carved spirals into wood, unable, or unwilling, to explain why. None had homes in the rigid order of Lancaster's farms and churches, so they were sent to the margins. The asylum itself was built near the edge of the Susquehanna River crossing, where few settlers lingered. The location was practical for the authorities. It kept the broken away from the town centers, while still close enough for grain, wood, and water supply. But locals noted something oddity. The land on which it was built had long been avoided. Farmers claimed the soil there was poor, that crops failed and cattle sickened. Lenape stories described the ground as singing when the moon was low, though what that meant was never written clearly in English accounts. Even before the first stone was laid, there was a feeling that the asylum was ill-fated. A Quaker elder wrote in his diary, "They have raised a house for the unwanted. It is not charity, it is a tomb before death." The asylum opened quietly in 1743, and from the beginning, rumors spread faster than facts. Workers claimed the walls seemed to sweat in summer, dripping with moisture, even when the air outside was dry. Nurses complained of hearing knocking in the floors at night, though the building had no cellar. Patients told stories of a figure standing in the corners of their rooms, silent, watching, disappearing when they screamed. But none of these accounts found their way into official records. Colonial authorities reported only manageable difficulties, as if a leaking roof or a shortage of bread could explain away the whispers growing among the people. It was into this uneasy, watchful atmosphere that the asylum entered history, already seen not as a place of healing, but as a place of dread. And in time, the dread would prove justified. By 1744, the asylum had already earned its reputation as a place of whispers. Though only a few dozen residents lived behind its barred windows, the stories about them spread across Lancaster County like wildfire long before the fire itself ever came. Some tales were mundane, escapes in the night, quarrels among keepers, the endless groans of the ill. But others spoke of darker things. A miller claimed he heard singing drifting across the river on moonless nights, though the asylum forbade music of any kind. A farmer's wife reported that her child returned home pale and trembling, after wandering too close to the grounds, muttering about faces in the grass. The building itself seemed cursed. The timber warped faster than expected, as if resisting the nails that held it. Fires broke out in the hearths, though no spark had fallen. More than one guard resigned after only weeks of service, describing dreams of burning halls that left them drenched in sweat. One even claimed to have awoken to find soot on his hands, though he had not touched the fire. Official reports ignored these accounts, but letters sent privately between clergymen reveal growing unease. One Lutheran pastor wrote to a colleague in Philadelphia, "They have built their asylum not upon stone, but upon memory. The land remembers, and those who dwell within it are marked by it." It was a curious phrase. The land remembers. To the settlers, it meant the weight of battles past, of lineate burial sites, of curses carried in soil. To the church, it suggested something more, that human sin seeped into earth itself, leaving stains no prayer could wash away. By this time, the asylum held more than just the mad. It confined the inconvenient, the beggar who disrupted services with ramblings, the widow who defied a preacher's authority, drifter who muttered about fires in the forest. Each was labeled unfit, though their true crime was often refusing to conform. The walls became a mirror of society's fear, a way of burying its outcasts alive. Yet the strangest accounts came not from the patients, but from the keepers. Guards whispered of voices that did not belong to any resident. Nurses told of doors that refused to open, though no lock barred them. At night, the wards grew restless, not in chaos, but in rhythm, as if stirred by the same unseen hand. All of this fed a growing conviction among locals: the asylum was not simply mismanaged, nor merely cruel. It was wrong. A structure raised on soil that had never wanted it, containing lives that were already marked by forces the colony could not explain. And still, the colony kept it standing, insisting that progress demanded order, and order demanded containment. Order can only be stretched so far before it collapses into fire. By the early months of 1745, tensions surrounding the asylum had reached a fever pitch. Publicly, colonial officials praised it as a beacon of civility, proof that Pennsylvania could manage its poor, its insane, and its undesirable with efficiency. Privately, however, same officials exchanged anxious letters, hinting at problems they dared not reveal. The archives of the Pennsylvania Assembly contain one such fragment, written in January of that year. "The House of Correction has become too costly to maintain. Its fires consume more wood than accounted for. Its walls seem to rot faster than we can patch them. We fear it has no future. We cannot admit this aloud." The cost of keeping the asylum fed and heated drained nearby communities, leading to growing resentment. Farmers accused the keepers of stealing supplies, while tradesmen whispered that their goods were cursed after crossing its gates. The asylum became less a charitable institution and more a burden, a black hole of resources, swallowing all given to it. And yet, perhaps the greatest burden was not material but spiritual. Quaker records from the time reveal that prayer meetings often turned, inexplicably, to the asylum. Worshippers described sudden chills, visions of flames, or an overwhelming urge to weep without cause. One minister wrote that the building casts a shadow further than its walls, and its sorrow weighs upon the land. The asylum had by then become more than a building. It was a symbol, a living metaphor of colonial fear, the fear of madness, of disorder, of poverty, of all that could not be tamed in the New World. But symbols have power. When enough people believe a place is cursed, the curse begins to breathe. And so, on the eve of its final tragedy, the asylum stood not as a sanctuary, but as a warning. Its barred windows stared out like blind eyes. Its chimney belched smoke, as though choking on the very souls it contained. Its keepers walked its halls with the wariness of men already haunted. Something was coming. Everyone felt it. Few would speak it. But history would soon burn it into their memory. The night of the fire is remembered less through official records and more through fragments of memory, folklore, and scattered testimony. What little the authorities wrote down was vague, almost willfully incomplete, as though by narrowing their words they could contain the horror. The date was October 12, 1745. Autumn had already stripped the field surrounding the asylum bare, leaving the land skeletal and wind-scoured. A bitter cold settled in early that evening, and by sundown the watchman at the western gate noted that the wind howled, like 100 men moaning at once. Inside, inmates pressed closer to the hearths, though the fires sputtered weakly. Survivors later claimed the wood itself seemed damp, as though soaked from within. Some insisted it gave off not the crackling of flame, but a hiss, like something resisting its own consumption. At approximately the 9th hour, a scream tore through the eastern wing. Eyewitness accounts differ. One nurse swore it came from a child locked in the infirmary. Another, no one was inside that room at all. Regardless, the sound spread panic. Keepers rushed with lanterns, only to find smoke billowing from beneath the doors. By the time the first door was forced open, the fire had already leapt unnaturally high. Witnesses claimed it moved as if alive, racing along beams and licking up the stairwell faster than any natural blaze. A physician present that night wrote in his journal, "The fire did not spread. It hunted. It seemed to select its path, driving us toward the northern hole like cattle to slaughter." What happened in the following hours remains contested, a battlefield of rumor and record. Some say the inmates rioted, tearing down doors in a desperate attempt to escape. Others say they sat eerily still, muttering prayers even as the flames drew near, as though waiting for judgment rather than fleeing it. Not everyone agreed on what really happened. As the blaze tore through the asylum's eastern wing, chaos spread faster than the flames themselves. Survivors described a dissonant chorus, crackling roar of fire, the pounding fists of prisoners against locked doors, and beneath it all, the low, unearthly chanting of voices no one could place. One orderly later testified, "I swear upon my life, there were voices in the halls long after every mouth had gone dry with smoke. They spoke in no tongue I knew. A litany, prayer, or perhaps a curse." The keepers tried desperately to maintain control. Some fumbled with iron keys, attempting to unlock cells, while others, overcome with fear, barred more doors shut, hoping to contain the inmates and save themselves. This act of self-preservation became a subject of bitter dispute in the years that followed. Did the keepers condemn dozens to death, or were they trying to prevent even greater catastrophe? One of the few surviving nurses recorded that the asylum's chapel, meant as a sanctuary, became a furnace within minutes. The great wooden cross above the altar caught fire, toppling as if in mockery, scattering embers onto the pews. Inmates huddled there had no escape. Witnesses swore the flames climbed the walls in the shape of reaching hands, grasping for those who prayed. Outside, villagers gathered at a distance, terrified but transfixed. Some tried to rush forward with buckets of water, but the heat pushed them back. One farmer wrote in his diary that the air itself reeked of pitch and sulfur, as though the very earth had opened. He claimed the fire gave off sparks of green, unnatural and cold, like witch fire in the woods. The asylum's bell tower told once, though no one had pulled the rope. That sound, deep, metallic, and solitary, seared itself into the memory of every witness. Some said it was a warning, others a final benediction, but still, the question lingered: was this merely fire, or something called forth? By midnight, the asylum was a pyre. Flames licked the night sky, visible for miles, as if summoning witnesses who would never forget. The building's stone foundation groaned like a living thing, cracking under the inferno's weight. Survivors recalled the screams most of all, not just of the trapped, but of something deeper. Several insisted they heard a woman's voice crying, "Return what was taken." Over and over, no woman in the asylum was ever accounted for in the final tallies. Others swore the cries were not human at all, but a chorus. Animal, spectral, unearthly. The fire spread with uncanny direction. Entire wings collapsed, while others remained intact until the very end, as if spared until their moment came. One corridor, according to the notes of a rescuer, burned in a straight line from door to door, each cell igniting like a candle. It was not a blaze, he wrote, but a procession. When dawn broke, the asylum was reduced to blackened stone and ash. Of the estimated 112 souls within, fewer than 30 escaped alive. The records list the others as perished in fire, though locals would forever whisper that they had not simply died. They had been claimed. The final mystery lies in the bodies that were never found. At least 20 inmates and 3 keepers had no remains among the ruins. No charred bones, no ashes, nothing. Some claimed they had fled into the woods. Others said the fire consumed them entirely, leaving no trace. But a third, darker theory emerged, that they had followed the voices they heard in the smoke, walking willingly into the flames. The official inquiry concluded with a single phrase: cause unknown. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. In the weeks that followed, Pennsylvania authorities scrambled to contain not just the ruins, but the story itself. Their official line was simple: a faulty hearth in the eastern wing had sparked the blaze, and negligence on the part of attendants allowed it to spread unchecked. It was a convenient answer, mundane, rational, and unthreatening. But even at the time, few believed it. Survivors disputed the hearth story vehemently. Several swore the fire had erupted not from wood or coal, but from the walls themselves, as though the stones sweated flame. Others recalled lanterns exploding into showers of sparks, despite being unlit when seized. Then came the villagers' testimony. Men and women from neighboring farms insisted the blaze burned in colors unnatural to any wood fire: green, violet, even black. Like the very soul of the asylum was alight. One farmer said, his words, hastily dismissed by magistrates, took root in taverns and marketplaces, where stories spread far faster than ink on paper. Religious leaders offered their own explanations. Quakers spoke of divine punishment, God's judgment upon an institution built on cruelty and confinement. Lutheran pastors, meanwhile, warned of demonic infestation, whispering that a ritual gone wrong had opened the way for hellfire. One Puritan pamphlet even named the asylum a temple of madness, toppled by its own iniquity. And yet, woven between these sermons and denials were the quieter accounts, letters, diaries, whispered recollections, suggesting something even darker. Not negligence, not divine wrath, but an intentional act. For some claimed the asylum had been set alight from within. Among the most unsettling threads of testimony were the whispers that someone wanted the asylum to burn. Several survivors accused the keepers themselves. One former inmate, a man named Elias R., claimed he overheard attendants discussing purging the halls with flame days before the fire. He insisted they feared an outbreak of disease, or worse, the spread of madness beyond the walls. Officials dismissed Elias as delusional, but the details stuck. The keepers had truly believed the asylum a contagion. Might they have chosen fire as their cure? A separate account pointed not to the keepers, but to the patients. In the rubble of the eastern wing, searchers found a crude circle carved into the floorboards. Scorched, yet still visible. Some said it was a prayer scratched by desperate hands. Others believed it to be a ritual mark, summoning powers best left unnamed. The theory of ritual gained ground when villagers spoke of the chanting heard during the fire. Too many witnesses swore to it, not screams, not prayers, but a cadence that pulsed with intent. Was it the madness of the inmates given form? Or had something older, something already present in the stones, joined their voices? A final, darker suspicion spread quietly among townsfolk that colonial leaders themselves may have sanctioned the blaze. The asylum had drained coffers, consumed resources, and embarrassed the assembly with scandal. Burning it, then declaring the tragedy, or an act of God, neatly erased both debt and accountability. But to admit this would mean branding the dead as sacrifices to politics. And so the truth remained buried, suffocated beneath layers of explanation. Still, one cannot help but wonder. If all were lies, why did so many dream of the asylum's flames long after they were extinguished? In time, the accounts grew stranger, diverging further from what officials could tolerate. Some survivors, haunted by guilt, confessed that they felt compelled not to flee. "It was as though something bade us stay," wrote one nurse, who survived only by leaping through a shattered window. "My feet wished to move, but my heart longed to burn." Others described visions in the smoke. One orderly claimed he saw faces, dozens, perhaps hundreds, emerging in the black plumes, mouths open in silent laughter. Villagers too reported that when the fire raged its hottest, they glimpsed shapes writhing within the blaze, figures not quite human, yet unmistakably alive. Folklorists who revisited the ruins in the early 1800s found stories still circulating. One tale told of a keeper who struck a bargain with the shadow in the stones, offering up the asylum's lives in exchange for his own. Another suggested the building itself was cursed from the beginning, erected on land once marked as forbidden by native tribes, where fire was said to cleanse the restless dead. The more rational historians clung to accidents: a lantern overturned, shoddy carpentry, human panic. Yet even they admitted unease. No ordinary fire, they noted, erased bodies entirely, yet dozens left no remains. No ordinary fire could toll a bell without hands to pull the rope. By the end, no theory fully silenced the questions. Some leaned toward accident, others conspiracy, others supernatural vengeance. And perhaps that is why the tale endures, because ambiguity itself haunts. For the asylum did not leave behind certainty. It left behind shadows, contradictions, and the uneasy truth that what burns brightest in memory is not always what can be explained. When the ashes cooled and the smoke drifted into memory, the asylum did not vanish from Pennsylvania's landscape. It lingered. The ruins stood for decades, a charred skeleton upon the hillside, too costly to rebuild yet too cursed to repurpose. Farmers refused to plow within sight of its broken walls. Children dared one another to approach, only to flee at the sound of shifting stones. For years, nothing grew there. The soil, blackened, refused seed. Grass turned brittle and yellow, and cattle driven too near sickened without explanation. Locals muttered that the ground itself had been salted with sorrow. Travelers passing along the old road spoke of strange lights flickering at night within the ruins. Some described them as lanterns swinging back and forth, though no watchmen were ever stationed there. Others swore they saw windows aglow, as if the asylum had risen from ash for a single night, filled once more with its condemned. By the early 19th century, the site had already entered folklore. Ballads were sung in taverns about the cursed fire on the hill. Children recited rhymes about the bell that rings itself. It became less a real place and more a symbol, a warning that cruelty breeds curses, and that institutions built on suffering are destined to collapse under their own weight. And yet, even as its tale drifted into legend, some who walked the ruins swore the stones still radiated heat, centuries after the fire. The generations that followed did not let the fire fade into silence. Instead, it was woven into the oral traditions of Pennsylvania's frontier communities. Families whispered the story at hearthsides, not merely as history, but as a cautionary tale. Mothers told their children, "Do not mock the broken or the mad," for their cries called down fire. Some spoke of cursed bloodlines. They claimed descendants of the keepers were marked, haunted by sleepless nights or struck by sudden misfortune. One tale insisted that a certain family never again built a home with a fireplace, fearing sparks would call the asylum back. Travelers passing through Pennsylvania in the late 18th century recorded strange encounters. One merchant wrote of meeting a gaunt woman on the road near the ruins, dressed in scorched linen, who asked him, "Did you hear the bell?" When he turned back, she was gone. Others reported flocks of crows circling endlessly above the site, as though trapped in their own morning vigil. Even learned men were not immune. Antiquarians who visited in the 1820s spoke in hushed tones of unsettled air and coes where no voice stands. They warned that the asylum's memory was not a mere tale, but an active presence, one that fed upon retelling. The more the fire was remembered, the stronger its shadow grew. By then, the asylum had ceased to be a ruin of stone alone. It had become a haunted chronicle etched into the very land. Even now, more than 2 centuries later, the fire's shadow persists. Historians pore over the scant records, chasing facts in ledgers half-burned, but the story refuses to stay still. It wreathes between history and myth, as though the asylum itself does not wish to be defined. Local folklore holds that on certain autumn nights, the ruined hill still glows faintly, as if embers stir beneath the soil. Hikers claim they have heard the toll of a single bell, its iron tongue long since melted. Some even speak of voices carried on the wind, low, fractured, pleading, repeating the same refrain, "Return what was taken." The site has become a place of pilgrimage for the curious, the devout, and the reckless. Paranormal investigators seek proof. Skeptics arrive determined to debunk, only to leave shaken. And locals, weary of outsiders, shake their heads and mutter, "Let the dead keep their secrets." But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the asylum is not in ghost lights or whispers, but in the unease it plants in those who hear its story, for it asks questions without answers. Was it merely fire, or something summoned? Were the missing consumed by flame, or did they walk into another realm? And why does the memory still burn so fiercely, long after the ashes cooled? Perhaps you will find the missing names, if you dare open the archives yourself. If you want me to continue uncovering these buried histories, subscribe now, and share your theory in the shadows below.